Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. I would like to introduce you to the VIU lecture, which was kindly organized and provided by Professor Giovanna Marconi, who I would like to thank. This evening we have with us Professor Andreas Philippopoulos-Mihalopoulos, who is director of the Westminster International Law and Theory Center, and who is going to address a lecture on the world is rooted in air, atmosphere, lawscape, spatial justice. We're obviously, everyone, all of us, we are very eager to learn more about this. And also I have read in the description of your background that you are radically interdisciplinary. So this is very much into the spirit of VIU, and I'm very looking forward to listen to your lecture. Thanks for coming. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Luca. Thanks so much for inviting me. And thank you so much for coming today. Recently I had a different description about myself, which I actually fancied even more than radically interdisciplinary, and that was post-disciplinary. So I kind of like that. The reason I like that is because I'm interested in not dwelling in one discipline, but actually floating about and trying to understand what I think are the most important things that cannot be associated or indeed being enclosed in one discipline. You know, for example, when they say law is far too important to be left to lawyers, that's exactly the case. Or architecture or cities are far too important to be left to architects. That's the kind of stuff that I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of the excess of disciplines. So what I am going to talk to you about today is it comes out of the book that I'm actually currently writing and finishing while I'm going to be in Venice by the end of this month, which is called Spatial Justice, I forgot, Bodies, Lawscape, Atmosphere. And these are issues that have been preoccupying me for a very long time now, and what I'm trying to do is essentially consolidate them and think of them as essentially a trajectory, as a journey that begins with the concept of lawscape, then it carries on to atmospherics, and then it moves on to spatial justice. But the reason I started with this idea of air is because I want to talk quite a lot about atmospheres and what it is that atmospheres do to us, as well as what it is that we do to atmosphere, how atmospheres emerge. So in a way, I want to construct a little bit of an atmosphere with you, if you would allow me. And it's not that this room is absolutely beautiful. Of course, there's no problem with the room. But I would like you to imagine a slightly different room. I would like you to imagine that you're entering a room whose walls are painted in this rather bright and invigorating red and yellow. I want you to walk into that room and sit down on a table and perhaps switch on your iPad or your iPhone and touch the screen. You know how to do these things. Then there's a Coke, in case you would like to have one, if that's your thing. Or you find yourself quite pleasantly atmospherically ensconced in that room. There's a pleasant, faint but pleasant smell of roses in the air, indeed. And there's a game of darts. Do you know what darts is? It's very English. It's very strange. This thing with, you go and they have tournaments on this. I mean, how boring can you get? So there's that thing in pubs, usually when you go and throw the things and all that stuff. So there is such a thing too, and all that stuff. And of course, nothing would be complete without a bit of... So all that is an immersion. I want you to go into that room and feel what you're supposed to feel and do what you're supposed to do, etc. So with this, I want to welcome you to the lawscape. And the lawscape is this rather strange thing, which I'm going to be revealing as we go along. And it has to do with space, and it has to do with law. So today I'm going to talk to you about a few things. First of all, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about air, and how air is something we tend to forget, but I want to bring back to the discourse, whatever discipline that discourse may belong to. I will also talk about the lawscape, and the lawscape I have defined already to you as this kind of connection between law and space. I will also talk about matter. So everything that I'm going to be talking about will have a very strong material understanding, material existence indeed, but I will not want to differentiate matter from the immaterial. So material and immaterial for me share the same surface. It's a bit like the symbolic or the linguistic that comes up and shares the same surface with bodies and the way the bodies move. So what we say, what we talk about, what we think is also reflected in the way we move and vice versa. The other thing that I'm going to be talking to you about is, I'm not going to just mention air, although air will be my starting point. I will be talking a little bit about fluidity as well as solidity. And some of the things that I want to engage with you will have to do with water or oil and other issues. Now this is all somehow landed in what is called the affective turn. Have you heard of this term before? The affect. So let me explain. Affect is this, it's very interesting because in Italian means something entirely different, just like in English, I suppose, to some extent. And affect is all about tenderness, it's about connecting in with affection. But this is not quite what I mean here, so I'll show you what I am trying to follow in terms of the term affect, which again shares the same kind of material and immaterial. It's something that connects us, but it's not quite material nor quite immaterial. At least not purely that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about spatial justice towards the end. I'm going to give you some pointers as to what I believe the spatial justice is, or the way that it should be defined. And all this I'm going to do within this concept of atmosphere. So let me begin by explaining the title of the talk. So Jeff Ryman is an he's Canadian, but he lives in the UK. A Canadian author who is vaguely recognized as science fiction or something like that. But indeed, I think he's a wonderful author because you cannot quite pigeonhole him. So you don't know exactly what he belongs to. And if you haven't read this book, it's called Air. It's quite a wonderful book, and I would advise you to read it if you have the time. It's about, what is it about? So Air, in this particular book, is about nocturnal sweats, is about some bizarre breaths that come in and haunt you from the inside. It's about information that comes and colonizes, not just bodies, but whole villages and countries. It's about certain capitalist ventures, but at the same time it's about this bizarre resistance. It's all about desire, in a way. And it takes place in this very odd sort of imaginary Asian highlands village. This is a sentence that I particularly love from this book. She was rooted in the world, but the world was rooted in air. There's something about the rootedness in the air which I think is particularly beautiful, the idea of roots that go into the air and end up nowhere. And of course this air is capitalized, it's an air that is charged with all sorts of informational affects. And in that sense, her roots, the roots in the world, are also the roots in the air, because the world is essentially rooted in air. For this, in order to kind of start a little bit the discussion, I'm going to use a visual aid, and these are the installations by Thomas Saraceno. Thomas Saraceno is quite well known. Even he presented his work in 2 biennales ago in Venice. And Thomas Saraceno always constructs these, how can I call them? Perhaps imaginary cities, very much like Italo Calvino, cities that hang from nowhere. And they are connected with all these strings, but at the same time, in most cases, they present these bubbles full of air that somehow partition the air. So they cut the air in the middle, as it were, and they have a little bubble of air within. So what Thomas Saraceno is trying to do is construct precisely this moment of isolation and yet openness, because all these bubbles are transparent. You can actually see through them. And in some of them, in some installations, you can actually play. You can walk in and jump around, and it's quite fun. Some of them contain water and earth and plants sometimes, etc. So on this basis, I wanted to talk a little bit about this distinction. And this distinction, the inside versus the outside, is a distinction that has been troubling me for a very long time. And I think it's in a way, it's the fundamental distinction of most disciplines. Also the fundamental distinction of what it is that it's a fundamental distinction of life, in the sense that, when you live, you're inside. When you die, you're outside. But what is this outside? So I would like to offer you my thesis, in a way, my position. And my position is that there is no outside. So if you start with a position that there is no outside, it means that you have to look inside. You have to look inside in order to create all these folds and waves and differences in being and becoming in order to carry on living. Because otherwise, inside becomes this big, immense, vast flatness, which has no interest. So, in a way, what I'm trying to do with this inside that has no outside is to bring the outside in. But remember, there is no outside. So what we have instead is something that I call the continuum and the rupture. So we have this continuum, which is this big inside, which carries on and moves on without differentiation in a way. But then we have these ruptures, the ruptures that rupture the continuum inside. These distinctions will become, I hope, clearer during the talk, but let's keep it for a moment. Inside and outside, and continuum and rupture. Let me give you a couple of definitions on atmosphere. These are quite standard ones. Gernot Böhme is a main German philosopher who has been working on atmospheres for a very long time. And he defines it as the common reality of the perceiver and the perceived, or the sense of being in something is mood. What is that? It's a waiting. It's a moment where we need something else. We feel that just to be in the atmosphere, just to allow the atmosphere to emerge is not enough. Gernot Böhme belongs in this school of thought which is widely understood as phenomenologist. And phenomenologists are, again, widely understood something that relates to the phenomenon, to the outside, as it is being experienced. So, again, I'm hugely simplifying, and I'm sorry about that. But phenomenology always resides in this understanding of the perceiver and the perceived, or indeed of being in something which is a mood, in German a Stimmung. But feeling our own presence, we feel the space, we feel its atmosphere. And of course, this is really important. I mean, it's important to be able to feel the atmosphere. Well, you know what you're talking about when you go into a bar and you say, this is a great atmosphere, it has vibe and all this stuff. Or you go to, a cemetery and you think this is a solemn atmosphere, What this kind of definition leaves out, or indeed includes, is this idea of dialectics. And dialectics is always about, someone this side and the other that side come and meet somewhere, and they create a synthesis. And this synthesis, we have been used to calling it the world. So the world is always a synthetic result of dialectics. So dialectics come from, a very, very long history, but the kind of dialectics I have in mind is a Hegelian dialectics, where we're talking about a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. And in a way, the atmosphere seems to be relying on this synthetic moment, where the perceiver and the perceived, that is the body that comes in and the bodies that are already there, come and become one synthetically into this moment of dialectics. This is exactly the kind of waiting of the dialectic. Dialectics cannot happen now. There's always a waiting of something that arrives and hopefully will arrive at some point. I'm not very keen on this, and I'll explain why. This is already a slightly better definition. This is by Ben Anderson, who describes atmosphere as a class of experience that occurs before and alongside the formation of subjectivity across human, non-human materialities and between subject and object distinctions. I say this is an already better one because we're talking about an alongside and before. So it's already talking a little bit about a surface, about a continuum, across human and non-human materialities. But then where I disagree again, and I have to take a bit of a distance, is precisely when he talks about between the subject and object, as well as when he talks about a class of experience, and finally, when he talks about subjectivity. So basically, I don't like this definition either. But the reason I want to keep it, at least part of it, is because of this human, non-human interchange. So I'm interested, first of all, in the materiality of the human and the non-human. What do I mean by that? You walk into a room, there are other human bodies, but there's so much more than just human bodies. Things that we don't even realize that they're there. So the chairs and the walls and the air that you breathe and the stuff that you already have in your stomach when you ate those cicchetti in the bar, and the spritz that you had and the spritz you're gonna have, and there's a present and there's a future, and there's something that a friend told you or something that your grandmother had, actually the way that she touched you when you were young, and then the way that you want to carry on with your night, but you're afraid that when you go back your boyfriend is going to be... This is an atmosphere. An atmosphere is not just a body and the perception. It's bodies that spread, that leak into the present, to the future, and different parts and in different bodies, and construct a momentary body that comes into some sort of contact, maybe, with other bodies. And these other bodies are not necessarily human bodies. So what is it that brings these bodies together? And what is it that happens when these bodies are brought together? Are they really brought together? Do we ever communicate with other bodies, with each other, etc.? Or is it simply a moment of being ontologically independent, as it were? We're trying to connect, but we always fail. Affects come from Spinoza. So Spinoza is one of these philosophers who's not very prized, although I'm not quite sure why it isn't. Well, actually, I do have some ideas about Spinoza, and the reason for which he's not as popular as other philosophers Spinoza is becoming much more popular increasingly because of this affective turn, the material turn, the spatial turn, all these things, the corporeal turn, all these things that we've been doing now in all disciplines, actually not even doing, we're being done by all these turns. We're being swirled and turned, and we don't know which way to turn because everything is happening now in full materiality. These things are reasons for which Spinoza is becoming much more popular. But Spinoza is quite a dangerous philosopher in the sense that it's positively the hardest philosopher to put into brackets or to understand in ethical terms, despite the fact that his most famous work is called Ethics. But Spinozan ethics are not standard ethics. In that book, he describes affects as the affections of the body by which the body's power of acting is increased or diminished, helped or hindered. Spinoza talks about bodies who come together or encounter each other indeed, and then one body becomes stronger or weaker from these encounters. And think about the way that you walk around the city of Venice, and you're being constantly, I don't know whether you've tried that, but you're being constantly, faced with a wall of tourists. This is a very strong body. It's very hard to go by, or it's very hard to negotiate. We do, we turn like that, we huff, we become Venetians, we start shouting and doing, rude things. No, Venetians are not. Actually, I always admired Venetians. I don't know how they manage not to be rude. But this is exactly the moment where you feel weak, because that body is so strong, it's a wall, and you have to negotiate it. Think of the way that a human body, is dealing with a tsunami. It becomes much weaker after that encounter, if it survives. Think of the way that not a human body, but say, a bird deals with a storm, etc., etc. So I'm trying to pluralize this. I'm trying to understand it as an encounter, and indeed that's a Spinozan take, it's not mine, of human and non-human bodies that are linked through moments of affect, the way that we're being affected by it. Now, affects have been taken over by Deleuze and Guattari in their work, in a lot of their work. And so they describe it as man, I'm sorry about that, as humans, I don't know, non-human becoming. So it's the human that constantly becomes non-human, that is, it becomes something else than just human. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And at the same time, affects go beyond the strength of those who undergo them. So affects are not simply something that you feel in your body, but it's something that exceeds the body. It's something that goes beyond the body of its emergence. So this is where I'm trying to think about connection. So what is it, this space between bodies that is populated by affects? What is the space that is brimming with affects between and with and through these bodies? And affects are constantly there, kind of circulating, but also exceeding the body. My definition of affect, and I'm skipping a huge amount of stuff now, unfortunately, but you just have to do. I'm trying to define affect as a multi-directional flow of sensory, so I want to include the senses, emotional, and informational events that affect bodies. Again, when I talk about bodies, I don't mean bodies, human bodies. I mean all sorts of bodies. So when I say all sorts of bodies, I mean material and immaterial bodies. So I'm talking about a body of discourse. I'm talking about the legal corpus. I'm talking about, do you see what I'm trying to say here? So I'm talking about everything that can somehow circulate and construct a space and an atmosphere. So these affects, these multi-directional flows of sensory, emotional, and informational share the same surface. So material and immaterial come together and create what I've called the affect. Now I want to talk a little bit to you about Michel Serres. Michel Serres is a French philosopher who has been writing consistently on, well, I suppose to some extent on bodies. And this is a quote from him, which I think is quite beautiful. The body exceeds the body or fails. I fear, therefore, I pass a chameleon in a gaudy multiplicity. I become a half-caste, quadroon, mulatto, octoroon, hybrid. So this photograph that I should give credit to my friend Andrea Brighenti, is one of my favorite photographs, and in fact is part of my screensaver. He's taken it, and I have. Can I be a bit confessional with you? I have a cat phobia. I don't like cats very much. I mean, it's not that I don't like them. I like them very much, but I think there's something going on there, and they might not like me, or I don't know. We're not comfortable. It's a bit tense when we are around each other. But this cat is a slightly different thing, precisely because there's a cat in the process of becoming or happening. I'm not saying that it's becoming human. I want to think of a human that is becoming a cat right now. So it doesn't impersonate a cat, but there's something going on in there. This is exactly the idea of the body that exceeds the body or fails if we don't become, and I don't mean become cats necessarily, but if we don't become other things around us, if we don't connect with technology, if we don't connect with medicine, if we don't connect with air, if we don't connect with each other, if we don't connect with our past, we fail. So it's always a kind of a process of connection, but a connection that exceeds the body itself. And this is quite counterintuitive, because we want to think of ourselves as units, as something that is quite solid, not exactly unchanged. But I ask my students very often every year, and I throw them in a bit of a disarray, when I ask them whether they have a sense of self. And pretty everyone, may I ask you whether you have a sense of self? You don't have to answer me, but just think whether you have a sense of self. I can see some people going like that. So I wonder what this sense of self is, and where do you stop when you define yourself? Is it something that it has to do with the way that you are, the way that you look in the mirror, the way that you look when you look in the mirror? Is it who you are in terms of your family? Is it who you're going to become? I'm not quite sure. I've always struggled a little bit with the idea of the sense of self. So I fancy this idea that we keep on exceeding this sense of self, that the sense of self isn't quite there at any point, but we need to construct it. So let me bring you back a little bit to this idea of the continuum, that the sense of self is something that we don't quite have. It's something that we have, and then it keeps on falling off our fingers. But we need to find ways of rapturing it, of blocking it, of putting in bubbles, like Thomas Saraceno does with his glass bubbles. We need to put into something like that so we can use it. We need an identity card. We need a Venezia card in order to go from one place to the other. This is exactly what we need to do. We need to somehow exceed the body. And a great deal of these ideas come from the concept of skin. And skin is this idea that somehow separates. There's a boundary. That's what we think. But then Michel Serres says, contingency means common tangency. Tangency means to touch. So common tangency is this idea of touching in common. So not just human beings touching each other, but when you put your hand in the water, that's touching, that's tangency. When you are here where you stand, you're being touched by the air or by the seeds underneath you. In it, the world and the body intersect and caress each other. We cannot claim to be so exceptional. Everything meets in contingency, as if everything had a skin. So contingency is this idea of opening up, not quite sure what is going to happen. And we're never sure. We think we can rupture the continuum through our skin. The skin is the thing that kind of stops things from coming in, right? And it does to some extent. But how many things come in at the same time? How many times have we had a cold? How many times have we, I love the North Americans when they say, oh, when you have a cold, you cannot shake your hand. Because, of course, that's where bugs get transmitted, which is cultural. I mean, in Europe, you don't have that. You don't kiss, maybe, in Europe, but you don't have this handshake, which is a really interesting thing of how this tangency means contingency, means that in the US or in North America, bugs do move through hands, but in Europe they don't. It's fine, you can do it. So contingency is a tangency of two or several varieties and reveals their proximity to each other. Water and air border on a thick or thin layer of evaporation, air and water touch in a bed of mist. So we're becoming a little more elemental now. So I want to bring in a recent work by Reza Nejarestani. Reza Nejarestani is this, I think, another uncategorizable author who has written recently, well, fairly recently, a few years ago now, a book called Cyclonopedia. And Reza Nejarestani has written this very strange book, which is not even half, a little bit of detective story, a little bit of archaeological thriller, a little bit of very difficult, very demanding theoretical essay, post-Deleuzian apocalypse, Middle Eastern politics criticism. It's crazy. I mean, do read it if you have the time. So Nejarestani says about fluid or wetness, which is essential for blending the dust particles into one narrative with multiple undertows. Now, for Nejarestani, dust, which is this moment of the solid and the fluid, envelops and carries different materials and essences of different groups and particularities, hard to grasp, but easy to commingle with fluid. I don't know whether you know this particular art installation here. It's at the block, London. It will come to me. And it's quite an extraordinary room where you walk in, and this is a corridor that you have to walk in, and it's actually quite deep. So you're walking, and this thing is up here, and you're surrounded by crude oil. So everything is a fluid, is a liquid that is totally static. You can touch it if you want. You have to wash your hands afterwards. I mean, you're not supposed to touch it. They wouldn't allow you. There's a guard who's very keen on not. The smell is quite overpowering too. But it's quite an extraordinary moment when you reach that final bit over there, where you feel surrounded by this very quite threatening, but at the same time strangely peaceful thing. And Nejarestani talks about oil as a narrative organizer. So we talk about a kind of a fluidity or an oil which is politically charged, financially absolutely invested, which has to do with narratives. So the way that whichever country has access to oil or for some reason needs oil, and we know various reasons for that, they can organize the narratives of the connections between the various countries or the various institutions. And this fluid or wetness is a particularly difficult thing to grasp, precisely because it's elemental. So again, Nejarestani, there is no darkness in this world which has not its mirror image in oil. So the oil becomes, and as we know, it's it's one of the greatest facilitators, but also one of the greatest problems of contemporary civilization. And it's interesting because oil remains a liquid, remains a fluid. So I want to think about fluidity in relation to what I said earlier about air. And I want to bring these things together and think about what atmosphere is. So atmosphere, I would argue, is the excess of affect that keeps bodies together. And then again, I'm trying to think of contingency. I'm trying to think of how these various bodies, the elemental bodies, the water and the dust and the liquids and the petrol, and the human bodies and non-human bodies come together and create this excessive affective circulation. So these bodies are kept together, but at the same time, atmosphere is what emerges when bodies are held together by, through, and against each other. So now you see it, now you don't, in a way. Atmosphere is something that you have to be part of. You cannot have an atmosphere that blooms away from you or from anyone. We're all part of an atmosphere. As soon as we enter a space, we contribute to the emergence of atmosphere. But at the same time, this atmosphere happens, as it were, against us. Sometimes we don't even want to be part of this atmosphere, but yet we are, because we don't even realize that it might be problematic for us. So, atmosphere, I want to think of also in geological terms as a force of attraction. That's the thing that keeps on, whatever comes into the atmosphere of the Earth gets burned, but at the same time is an attraction, is a force, is a gravitational force that keeps us quite close to whatever it is, the object, the desire, perhaps, of whatever it is. Atmosphere at the same time has a different velocity, so atmospheres work much faster than individual bodies because they're an emergence, and as emergences, they have a different spatial and temporal distribution than the bodies that construct these atmospheres. So at the same time, atmospheres are constructed things, and this is the whole idea behind Saraceno's bubbles, and this is the whole idea about all these things, all these experiences that we have, especially in Western countries, about atmospherics. So atmospherics, the first thing that they have to do is separate the inside and the outside. The importance of a bent glass is huge, because you need to feel safe. Think about gated communities. The idea of gated communities being, the community you can actually lock up and you can stay in at night, which characterizes huge amounts of cities, and it's all about this sense of safety, which is constructed because there is a wall, and there's a wall that separates the outside from the inside. Atmosphere is all sorts of things. It's this idea of wanting to be in your kitchen and closing your kitchen and locking it up and saying, I'm going to be safe in here. It's not just though questions of safety. It could be an atmosphere of a shopping mall where you go in, and as soon as you enter the shopping mall, you enter this mood, this being of walking around and shopping, because there's not much else to do. So that's what you do, you shop, right? Recently, some of the shopping malls that I've been, the individual shops don't even have gates or doors. It's all open. It's quite an extraordinary thing. They have no door. The banks and pharmacies and whatever and clothes shops, which are completely open access. So you walk through the corridors and you slide in effortlessly in new, wonderful spaces of consumption. It's quite safe in an atmosphere. I think that's a problem, and the good thing about atmosphere is that we feel quite safe. We don't want to leave. In that sense, it is the outside that is always included inside. How is that? Because we construct an outside inside. We construct a little moment of threat, cold, otherness, whatever it is that you want to do. There's always this moment of something that threatens or something that is outside it. Or it can be a question of atmospherics of conflict. And because I realize that until now I have given you the impression that atmospheres is all about peace and tranquility and coziness and all that stuff. But the atmospheres of intense conflict. And that is another part of the atmosphere which relies on desire. When you are in a square and you're fighting for your freedom, for example, that is an atmosphere. The whole body becomes emergent with other bodies, and through and against these bodies, an atmosphere emerges. An atmosphere of desire for maybe even conflict itself, or maybe freedom. There is a horizon in the desire. Whatever it is, there's always this moment of the inclusion of the outside inside. There is the ancien régime that we want to fight, or there is the presence of the police that is there and we want to turn against. We have to separate that it's us and them. And that is a very important gesture of atmospheres. And this them is included inside as a problem, as an issue that has to be resolved in a way. Sloterdijk talks about an enclosure so spacious that one would never have to leave it. And in his book World Interior, The Glass House of Capitalism, essentially, is precisely this idea of how globalization, ideas of Western society on the whole, is precisely this spacious enclosure that doesn't have an end. So globalization is something that takes up the globe, indeed. And the final way in which atmospheres are being engineered is through this impression of synthesis, that everything that we want is in there. And this is something really quite difficult to achieve, but Najarastani here says to distill all cosmic processes into one unified body, cyclically infinite yet functionally restrictive. Everything must be unified. And that's exactly the moment where everything, and in globalization, discourses and all that, immerse us in. They invite us in, they drag us in. There is no outside. The outside is brought inside. The outside is the threat, is the other, is the problem, or it's nothing. We shouldn't worry about it. We are here, we are safe in our desire for conflict, we are safe in our desire for change, we're safe in our desire for freedom because we have an ideological position which is very strong, or we're safe in our consumerist practices, we're safe in the way that we believe that we are true to ourselves. And this is exactly the problem with atmospheres, that allows a sense of self to be developed which corresponds with a desire. We want to be in an atmosphere. Nobody pushes us in there. Nobody locks us up in an atmosphere. Atmosphere is something that emerges between the bodies, with the bodies of its emergence. So remember the room when you got in? So this room is painted on red and yellow, and this is a trademark by Kodak, and it has been registered. Remember the Coke? Well, the Coke, you open the Coke. So there's so much about Coke. But this one, this is a registered trademark for Coke. It's meant to make you feel thirsty. You want to drink some, right? The ideas of dress design, that is for example, these products that feel like banana or feel like strawberry, and that's exactly the sensorial moment of your belonging to the atmosphere fully. And then there's a registered trademark which is red. Can you actually register red? Color red? Yes, you can. I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar with this object of desire of most women and some men. The idea of registering colors, registering as trademarks, registering sounds, registering what is called the design dress, that is the way that a shop is being set up. So McDonald's, the way that everything works in there. So where the tables are, how the walls will look, how the people the waiters and all that stuff will serve you, the way they're going to move, what they're going to say exactly, not of course what you're going to eat and how you're going to unwrap your hamburger and all that stuff. Absolutely everything is included in this perfect atmosphere. Remember that the music that you heard, Fluidity by Beethoven, the first few notes have been a registered trademark by a company. You think, how can you register Fluidity by Beethoven? Didn't he write it? Yes, but we can register as a trademark because we used it. How can you register a smell? Do you remember the faint smell of roses? Guess where it comes from? It comes from the floor. The floor is rubber, But because they want to cover up the rubber floor, and they do well because we don't like the rubber smell, they added an artificial scent of roses. So it makes you feel good. The combination of the rubber floor and the rose scent is a registered trademark. The darts, you remember the darts at the end where you could actually do something with that? These are very strangely, this is the weirdest thing. I mean, please, this is the weirdest thing. They smell of dark beer because they play with the desire, essentially masculine desire quite often, to be in a pub environment, play darts and drink dark beer. Perfect, right? So you have darts that smell of black beer. It's crazy. So it keeps on going. There are huge amounts of examples, what they call in intellectual property law sensory depletion. That is, we are being constantly reduced in terms of our senses, and the freedom we thought that we had is all directed corridors of compulsion. We are desiring what we are desired to desire. Our desire is a body from which we cannot escape. And perhaps the only way is to take a little bit of a distance precisely from this body of desire. But it's not that easy. So, Thomas Saraceno again, and for me, Thomas Saraceno is this very interesting combination of, as I said, the inside and the outside, but in a way is a perfect inside. It has managed to perfect itself to maintain life inside, but also to allow the outside to be seen from the outside and vice versa. So the idea of the lawscape, which is something that I've made up a few years ago, and I've been working on it, and I know it's not a particularly elegant term, but what I have imagined with the lawscape is precisely this tautology between space and law. So what I described to you earlier is precisely part of the lawscape. The fact that everything, the way that we're sitting now, where we're sitting, the fact that we're here, is all contained in the lawscape. What you're wearing is usually something that you haven't stolen from a shop, you haven't shoplifted, but it's something that you bought, you have a right to wear. The fact that we're sitting here, we have some sort of right of entry to this particular space. We've been invited, or we're paying our fees, or whatever it is. The fact that we have a camera there means that we paid the electricity bill. The fact that we have, all the stuff that is around us is part of the lawscape, which means that there's laws that potentially or actually determine everything that we do or we don't do. The fact that in order to get out of this island, you need to pay the ticket for the vaporetto to go back to Venice. That's a contract. You pay, and that's how you can go in and you can go there. That is the lawscape. And in a sense, there is nowhere where the lawscape finishes. The lawscape is something that carries on pretty much forever. And now when the lawscape does this play, though, the lawscape is not just the tautology, but the lawscape is this interplay between visibilization and invisibilization of law and space. When you go to a shopping mall, you don't want to be reminded of the law all the time. You want to be reminded of how pleasant it is to be there. You want to be reminded of the luxury of space. You want to be reminded of, I don't know what. I don't like shopping malls, so I can't talk very much about them. But it's all about the visibilization of space and the invisibilization of law. So there's the law is sort of pulled back in a way. If you go to a prison, especially if you're inside, it's all about the law being fully forced, totally there. The law becomes space. The space is electrified, literally electrified with law. So the doors close electrically, so that you're always in a space of law. You don't even have to go to a prison. Go to an airport. It's the same thing. You walk through the customs and all that stuff. It's frightening. It's becoming even worse every time. I mean, the kind of bottles you have, the kind of things you have, the biometrics and all that stuff. This is the standard biopolitics that Foucault has been talking about for all these decades. But it's a bit more too, because the lawscape tends to play a little bit with this visibilization and invisibilization. So sometimes there's always a bit of law and there's always a bit of space, but it's kind of a visibility issue. the lawscape wants to become atmosphere. So the wet dream, the fantasy of the lawscape is to become an atmosphere. So in that sense, an engineered atmosphere or an atmosphere is precisely a lawscape which invisibilizes the law so much that directing desire in a circular way in order to reinforce the very atmosphere. So atmospheres are purely self-maintaining things. They are there because the bodies rely them, generate them, want them, create them through the bodies and through their presences. So a lawscape is something before an atmosphere. Lawscape is the invisibilization and visibilization of law and space, and then the wet dream of the lawscape is to become, even momentarily, an atmosphere. And an atmosphere is something where bodies forget themselves, and they become one with air and liquid and elementally there. So I often, one of the tasks that I have with my students in London is to, at some point in the course, to ask them to go and discover the lawscape. So they come out, they go out in London, and they start sort of taking notes or mapping the lawscape and trying to see where there is the law and where there is space, and where they feel more this or that, or where they use their different senses, etc. And the finds are quite extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. I mean, they come up with beautiful ideas. And they all start with this immediate kind of political visibility, CCTV cameras. You know, they're there and they make you feel blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, when you're looking for the lawscape, you're actually looking for cameras, right? But then slowly they start realizing, you know what, traffic lights, that's a lawscape, that's part of the lawscape. Pavements, the fact that you can, zoning that is, you know, cars going there, pedestrians go there, pedestrian zones, private property, public property, and then it becomes quite crazy and they get lost in parks and they try to find their inner animal. It can become a bit funny, but they're all fantastic and they're all up for it. And so when they are out there and they're trying to understand the lawscape, they always come back precisely with a sense of a wall. Like, asphyxiation. There's nowhere outside the lawscape. We are kind of constantly kind of locked up in a constant interplay between law and space. And yes, we are. But there might be some ways out. Remember when I said about this distancing between the body of the desiring body and the body of desire. So we feel that we desire something, whether it's the Louboutin high heels or whether it's whatever it is. In Selfridges, which is one of the iconic shops in sort of department stores in London, they have this extraordinary campaign, sales campaign, that they've been using it for a very long time now, like 4 years or something like that. And it's actually made up by an artist. And the big signs, yellow signs, writing the big names, touch me here, I make you happy. Or you didn't find me, I found you. Or you know, I can't remember really amazing things about, you know, the freedom of guilt from guilt. You don't feel, it's not you, it's a desire that pushes you into there. So you just grab that Louis Vuitton because you just have to have it. So the needs obviously become obvious once you see the product. I mean, you didn't know that you needed Louis Vuitton in purple, green, and magnolia. But then when you see it, you realize you definitely need it. I mean, how else are you going to survive? So this is the kind of the really interesting moment of kind of the asphyxia of it, but then the possibility of taking a distance from the desire. Where does this come in and how does it come in is very difficult, because I'm trying to argue for a possibility of withdrawing from an atmosphere that is becoming aware of an atmosphere and withdrawing from it. So breaking the atmosphere in a way and landing back to the lawscape, because the lawscape is everywhere. You cannot avoid it. So the lawscape is constantly here. So when you go back to the lawscape, you can start a little bit the negotiation between the visibility and the invisibility. Where you stand, how visible you want your law to be, how much you want to be reminded of the fact that this credit card has a limit or not, and you know, that kind of stuff. In an atmosphere, you don't think of that. You get So in that sense, the movement of withdrawal of one body, actual body from the desire, is what I have called the spatial justice, the concept of spatial justice. So spatial justice has been used quite frequently and very disappointingly as either regional democracy or some sort of resource distribution or local some sort of participation, etc. Spatial justice has the potential radical ideas in it about space and lawscaping understandings, and what is justice. So each body, for me, and that's why I'm thinking about spatial justice. Spatial justice is the necessity of each body to occupy a specific space at a specific time. This is a necessity as well as a desire. Nobody can somebody can sit on you, but nobody can sit in you. You cannot be substituted by the desire of the other to come in and occupy your space, the body, the space that the body is. And when I say again, the body, I have to remind you that we're not talking just about the bodies as such, with the skin, but the leaking body, the thing that keeps on happening and becoming differently. So spatial justice is precisely this desire, the question of wanting to be in somebody else's space. Think of Israel and Palestine. Think of how geopolitical conflicts are all about that. Think about access to resources. Think about how the idea of wanting to be corporeally positioned in a place where you have access to petrol, air, water, and other things is exactly the moment of exclusion of others. So spatial justice is a question, it's not an answer. It's not a moment that arrives. It is a question that does something to the conflict. What does it do to the conflict? It allows the corporeal withdrawal. So I define spatial justice as the movement of withdrawal of the law with the aim of a possible emergence of a space of a different second legality. That is the lawless legality of justice. So the lawless legality means that there is always law. Remember, we always land in the lawscape. But precisely because there is this potential of moving, breaking away from the atmosphere, and arriving at a space, at the lawscape, which allows perhaps for this different second legality, the lawless legality of justice. That is a moment that it's not a guarantee, of course, it's not a prescription, but it happens, it keeps on happening, and it keeps on happening all the time in small little things, everyday stuff, having a coffee at the bar and who gets first and all that, to much, much bigger things. Tahrir Square. Now, Tahrir Square in Cairo, we know how it's ended and how it keeps on ending, and the tragedy in which it keeps on ending. So the question is, was there spatial justice? Or because there was nothing coming out of it, no change of regime, there was no spatial justice? And I would argue that there was spatial justice, with all the problems, with the huge gender issues, with the huge problems of women being raped, and with this crazy condemnation to death of 500 odd people. Even then, even after all that, there has been a moment where there was a change. There was a change because there was a withdrawal from the atmosphere of the old regime and a movement to a renegotiation, a reoriented lawscape. And that is the second, as it were, the different legality. However, it has to happen again and again. It's not something that can happen once, and that's it. The whole point of spatial justice, and this is its temporality of spatial justice, it has to be repeated. And this is the kind of the repetition that produces difference rather than identity. Is it repetition not of the same, but every time a different scape, a different lawscape, and a different orientation to the lawscape? So I just want to end with this a little spectacular, if you would allow me. This thing, do you like Wagner? You do? No, I don't like Wagner either. I prefer Puccini, but there is one opera by Wagner which is a little Pucciniana, and it's the Flying Dutchman, the Fliegende Hollander, who is one of the first early operas anyway by Wagner, and it's certainly the first one that Wagner began using the famous leitmotif. A leitmotif is this idea of a musical sentence that is being used in order to characterize a body, a specific body. Body meaning human, but as well as elemental. And in this particular, the Fliegende Hollander, it always characterizes the same kind of it kind of appears in pretty much in the same way. Subsequently, in his more complex operas, the leitmotif has become a machine of different variations. It keeps on repeating itself in completely different contexts, being colored by the different contexts, etc. What I want you to listen to is I'll play two pieces. One is the beginning, is the just 1 minute of the introduction. And the reason I want to play this is because of that. The story is as such. There's the boat, the ship that comes into the port, and this ship is a ghost or something like that. There's kind of a piracy involved issue and something like that. We don't know. The thing is that there's a guy there who's a bit of a ghost and all that stuff, and he has to sort of travel the seas for about 7 years. And then for only a few hours, I don't know, days or something like that, he manages to reach land and finally come out to the land and all that stuff, and all that's fine. The whole point of his reaching the land is to find a love interest. So as soon as he finds a love interest, and if the love interest reciprocates his love, then the curse will be broken and 7 years will end and all that stuff. So it is quite interesting though, and that's what I want to play initially. It's really interesting to listen to the beginning, where there is a moment where the first leitmotif of the wind on the sea, that is the wind on the sea and the waves that are produced, is being heard. And the wind is something like a narrative organizer. It's something that begins there, it's an elemental thing that keeps on stirring things up. So the surface of the sea becomes obviously waved and all this stuff. But this also announces the moment of the arrival of the ship. So, and you will be able to hear, I hope, the turbines. So there's several leitmotifs coming in. So this is kind of the actual leitmotif of the Fliegende Holländer, the actual flying Dutchman. And now is the sea. Can you hear the... So this is exactly the wind with the water that come in and create these kind of waves, or they kind of bring things and kind of constantly upturning them, but at the same time guiding them towards something, whatever this is going to be. And there's kind of a teleology. There's a moment where the elements come together and create this atmosphere. So as soon as you hear this, you know you're in for a good time. It's going to be quite an exciting opera. There's going to be lots of coming and going. There's going to be quite a lot of wind and all that stuff. So this is just the first minute of the introduction. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip all the between, and I'm just going to play the very final bit of the opera. And the reason I'm going to do that is because you see, you're going to hear how the wind comes back. Because at some point there was something that, they found. The love interest was found, something like that. They kind of, all right. There was a bit of a complication. There was a lover somewhere there who was really annoying and kind of tries to stop her, but she actually really loves him and all the stuff. But the guy is already gone, and she is looking at him from the land, and he's already somewhere there on the boat. And the question is, will she jump? Will she not jump? And she jumps, and there is a wind again, and there is the sea, and the sea kind of swallows her up. So I just... it's not just the end, but listen to that. So this is the conclusion, the final moment. It is full blast wind. And it's going to sound interestingly Beethoven-like, because it's going to have 7 ends. So just listen to the end. So we begin right now, and then it goes on for another 7. The question is, Wagner wants them to be united at the end. Do they get united? Is it a continuum? Or is it actually... Thank you.